I should just say that prior to being on the far left of Sylvia, I was a member of the Greens for 8 years on 2 federal election campaign committees and the New South Wales delegate to the Australian Greens before my fall from grace. I'm going to start with my conclusions, and some of you can leave the room for the next 10 minutes if you'd like. My first conclusion is that if we want a society where the 1% no longer rule, we need something quite different to a Green government. Secondly, if we want serious progressive social change, politics and government are the last place we should think it can come from. But there are some grounds to think that we can find where it can come from. I'm not going to talk so much about the concept of the 1% versus the 99%. I think Thomas Piketty's book has become a sensation that everyone's talking about. One of the people reading Thomas Piketty's has been Christine Milne, and she recently wrote on her blog, "You get to the point, as I have now come to believe, that we no longer do live in a democracy, but a plutocracy, a country governed by the wealthy for the wealthy." I'm told that Christine, not previously known as much of an anti-capitalist, has a major article coming out on this theme in the journal Island. More recent concern about plutocracy has come because of the antics of Clive Palmer. It's seen that his party is not even for the 1%, but the whatever the percentage him as an individual and his business interests are in Australia. There are allegations that he's able to buy votes with his wealth, and they've come from both the right and the left. We see the apparent buying of politics in all the ICAC revelations. So can anything really be done about this? Does it mean that if the Greens ever get in power as a government, that these powerful interests will simply stop any progressive change? Unfortunately, we have some recent historical examples and current examples that should make us feel nervous about the outcomes. The Greens have shared governmental power several times in the last 30 years in various places in Australia, and the results have not exactly been a political success. Every time the Greens have been in some kind of alliance, they've been punished afterwards at the ballot box, and Shane talks about how much the ACT Greens went backwards between their first alliance and currently. And here's how Christine Milne describes the 2 older Tasmanian experiences. She was talking in 2008, just after the GFC. She said, reflecting on those experiences in the 80s and 90s, the majority Liberal government of Robin Gray had driven the state into a parlous economic situation, and the Labor-Green Accord had to turn it around. It was a difficult period of protests and unrest as the public service was slashed and public spending was cut. The Greens never wavered from the task, nor did we do so with the Rundle government, when again we had to rectify the reckless spending of the Groom majority Liberal government. Of course, it's not to say that the Greens have not made a green mark on governments they've been part of. The carbon price, I think, is a key example. Christine again said at the time of the deal with Gillard, "We certainly have ownership of this scheme because it's the one we put on the table ourselves. So it's our proposal, our idea, we own the idea, we own the process." This seems like a powerful position to be in, yet actually now that entire period lies pretty much in tatters. And Christine's been willing to talk about a deal with Abbott on his direct action handouts to the big polluters of the 1% in exchange for hanging on to the renewable energy target, which is a worthwhile policy. Even the emissions trading scheme itself was a way to get big business on side because it was a market mechanism rather than a direct challenge to the big polluters. So I think and also recently, on the issue of ICAC, I mean, there's some people here wearing their We Love ICAC t-shirts. John Kay has said that ICAC is the most important source of accountability in our state. You'd think actually the democratic will of the people was. Actually now people are thinking about these kinds of mechanisms to control a runaway politics. And it also says something about the way that politicians are declaring their impotence at the power of the 1%. So I think there's 2 levels we need to understand why politics has become, or perhaps has always been, such an ineffective arena for serious progressive social change. Now, the first of them is more recent. There has been a real hollowing out of the representative political system over the last 30 to 40 years in Australia. Once you had parties with mass memberships, mass associated organisations, they were able to deliver votes year after year, election after election. They had a high level of activism inside them. The ALP was at the centre of this for all of the 20th century. The mass trade union movement, I mean, to give you an idea, between 1914 and 1990, union density, proportion of workers inside the unions, fell below 40% only once in the middle of the Great Depression. And since 1990, it has dropped precipitously, not just under 40%, but down to 17%. And the union structures themselves are hollowed out shells. There's hardly any of the activism and impetus from the rank and file workers left. The parties of the right themselves, they often existed simply to be the anti-Labor parties. And now that they've lost their reason for existence because the Labor Party's social base has been so hollowed out, they've had their own problems, and we can see that in the crises of various state and now the federal Liberal government. But most importantly, most voters now feel terribly detached from politics, and that's even being remarked on in all the mainstream media over the last 12 months. It's the reason that Clive Palmer can win the trolling the political class vote. The Greens themselves, I think, spent a period of time being outsiders to the political establishment. The ALP, as it became more and more irrelevant to people's lives, many people started to look to the Greens as a real alternative, but it was also an anti-establishment alternative. You could certainly see it in 2010. People voted for the Greens in that election who would have never otherwise voted for the Greens because they were so appalled by the Labor Party's collapse on climate change and other issues in that year. But you can also see how after 3 years of being the consummate political insiders, the Greens really paid the price for that. They were tainted by the stench of the Gillard government. But I think the recent political crises show us something else. They show us that the political system can't simply rule over us as it did either, precisely because people are detached from it. There's no mechanism to deliver the kinds of pro-business reforms, let alone left-wing reforms, that there used to be. Think about hockey's budget. It's been a disaster for the Liberals. They are unable to implement serious pro-capitalist reforms. Here you have a serious pro-capitalist party with a crossbench of serious pro-capitalists like Clive Palmer, and yet they still can't deliver serious pro-capitalist reform. There's a real breakdown of these things. And it's important to understand that political crisis is worrying the 1%, who are now worried that if there is another economic crisis, they're not going to be able to bring the people along with the kind of sacrifice they always demand. There's a second level, though, I think we need to look at this issue, which is a more general one. Are politics and government really arenas for serious social change anyway? Especially social change that could challenge the 1%, challenge the rich and powerful. I would argue that there is a confusion at the heart of this idea that political power can do these things. Because I think there's two types of power in our society that are not always the same thing. There's social power and political power. Now, the limited gains that workers were able to win through parties like the Labor Party and through their trade unions over the years, whether there was a Labor government in or a Labor government out of power, comes out of the fact that they were socially organised in trade unions. They were actually organised themselves in their own interests, and that related to the political system. I mean, you can't imagine 30 years ago that if Qantas had announced 5,000 job cuts, all you'd have is trade union leaders running and asking a Conservative Prime Minister like Tony Abbott for a bailout. But that's what we got this time. That kind of social power is, organised social power in relation to the parties is gone now. The difference, when you look back at the Whitlam era, where there were mass social movements and social struggles and worker struggles, actually the reforms that Whitlam delivered were not in a vacuum. There was real muscle on the ground to back that up. But such gains were always limited, because in the end, capitalism's been in charge socially the whole time that we're talking about, the whole last century. And in the end, when capitalism got in trouble in the 1970s and 80s, it was the ALP and the trade unions who actually used their social base to deliver wage cuts, to deliver the full neoliberal program in the 1980s, and that's what led to the current political unravelling. So what's the alternative? This seems like a pretty bleak kind of area. I think there is actually an alternative. The left used to know, this is way back in the day, that serious social change requires a serious social movement. That's a movement of many, many people on the ground in their own interests. The problems of the capitalist system and of politics mean that there is now an opening again. You look at places like Egypt and Spain, where millions of people have moved into action in their own interests, and it has really shaken things up. And importantly, these movements are increasingly against politics. You look in Spain, the Podemos party that has come out of the Indignados movement actually talks about the political caste and the need to smash up the existing political order. Now, for whatever its weaknesses, they are clearly drawing on a mass sentiment that is present in embryo in societies like Australia as well. Because they have to reflect that anti-political mood, it tells us something about where we might see social change coming from. Now, I think we look back at the last century, and if we're honest, there's a lot of disappointment of the left pursuing a strategy of entering politics to make social change, then delivering little in the way of that kind of change, or perhaps even worse. I'd suggest that we need new thinking about the relationship of progressive social change to politics. I think we need to grasp that this is actually an antagonistic relationship. And given the mood of the public towards politics and politicians, including Greens politicians, I hate to say, this also seems like a very pragmatic place to start thinking about how we're going to win social change. Thank you.